Right, welcome back to Inclusive Design 24 2024, brought to you in partnership with our Platinum supporters, Barrier Break and Intopia, and our Gold supporters, Infoaxia and Tetralogical. You can follow us on Mastodon, and if you have any questions for the presenters, you can post them there with the ID24 hashtag, or, which might be easier, you can put your comments directly in the YouTube chat somewhere down here. We'll gather your questions for our Q&A at the end of the session. Now, a reminder that ID24 is a respectful community, and you can find our code of conduct on the Inclusive Design 24 website. Now, I'm thrilled to be joined by a longtime friend of the event, both as a speaker and as a guest host, Lee Dale.
Thanks so much, Patrick. Really great to be here once again. And really, I'm pleased to welcome Heydon Pickering, talking about the folly of chasing demographics. Over to you, Heydon.
Thank you very much. Yes, the talk is called The Folly of Chasing Demographics. It used to be called You Don't Know Your Users and You Never Will, but bit of a long story, but it was asked to be changed. So it now has two titles, just to be difficult. And my name is Heydon. I'm a lot of different things, but most of those things are to do with the web. I design stuff and I develop stuff, and I do generative artwork. And most of the time I actually write. I write books, or I write design system documentation and things like that. And I make videos which you will either like or very much not like. And you can find me on frontend.social. Which is a Mastodon instance there. That's mostly where I lurk these days. I don't really use Twitter or any other social stuff. So yes, I was asked the last time I gave this talk to give a content warning because the folks who hosted me discovered that it had references to Nazism, terrorism, and addiction. I will not be talking about any of these things favorably. I am an anti-fascist. My 5-star review on Yelp for fascism was 0 out of 5 stars, and I think that's to my credit. So a few anecdotes to sort of contextualize this. When I first met the Sri Lankan owner of my local corner shop in the UK, he asked me this question: "Where are you from?" And I was a bit perplexed. I said, "Well, here, like round this way," which happens to be Norwich, the only city in the world to be excommunicated by the Pope. Just a little Norwich fact for you there. Like round this way, where we are now. And he replied, "Yes, but where originally?" Which is not something which basic white people like me tend to be asked. And I thought, but I'm a white English person from England. And pictured on screen, in case you can't see it now, is a tiny violin. It's difficult to convey just how small it is because it's only a emblematic violin, but I would say it's the size of a medium to large thimble. The other day I was in a coffee shop. These are all true stories, by the way. The other day I was in a coffee shop. As I left the counter to take a seat, an older man laughed and asked, "Are you Indian?" I said, "No, I'm just white. I'm English. I'm from here, around here." To which he said, "Well, you look Indian." To which I said, "Thanks. So do you." And he replied, "Well, I am Indian." Okay. Which made his remarks all the more flattering, but also all the more confusing for me. But white English people in England don't think I'm Indian. No, they sometimes, and more often than you might expect, think I'm Chinese. This is based primarily on two factors. One, my hair is straight, and two, my wife happens to be Chinese, which is very fucking scientific. So where do people imagine my wife is from? We might as well cover that as well. Japan, or they don't think she's from Japan. They'll either guess Chinese or Japanese because they're the only Asian people. It's either one or the other, right? And so 50% of the time they'll say Chinese and they'll guess correctly, and 50% of the time they'll say Japanese. So now pictured on screen is a deliberately confused looking visualization or diagram, which features a couple of circles, a jagged line, which is sort of floating in front of those circles, arrows pointing in all different directions, and distributed over the diagram are the text: ignorance, Japan, China, lack of self-awareness, and lack of social skills. Okay, so what about when I'm in China? Because I do visit China because I have Chinese family. Am I the so-called token white guy there? No, as one of the very few people not clean shaven, and this is confusing, I appreciate, because I am currently clean shaven. But the first couple of times I went to China, I had a beard. I must be a Uyghur Muslim because Han Chinese people that part of China tend not to have facial hair. So Allahu Akbar to all of my Muslim friends. I'm not Muslim. Some people who are so confident in their demographic designations, they won't change them, even when the subject of those designations, in this case me, but it could be anyone, corrects their assumption, which is really something. And I have another anecdote where this did happen. So I was one time at the bar in a central London pub. The woman serving me had a wonderful Central or South American accent. I don't know which, because as I keep explaining, I'm just an ignorant English person. Anyway, she asked me where I'm from. And I give the usual sort of answer, as you've already heard. Oh, just around here. Well, not London, but nearby. And just to clear things up for folks who aren't from the British Isles, this is what it looks like. It is not all London. Not everyone from the UK or from the British Isles is from London. There are other cities, and in fact, it's composed of multiple countries. So she's not happy with my answer, which is weird because I'm just telling her something I know to be true about myself. And she shakes her head. Wow. I'm not sure really what to do at this stage in the conversation. I'm just trying to get a pint of beer. Okay, where do you think I'm from, I ask. And without even a momentary pause, she replies, Afghanistan. And I wonder, why did nobody tell me this? Why am I learning now in my early 40s that that's where I'm from? Allahu Akbar, by the way, to my Muslim friends. What can we learn from all this? One, I shouldn't be a web developer or a technical writer or any of those other spurious things that I said that I did. I should be an international spy. And two, people should stop guessing other people's identities and by extension, their interests or needs. And this is foreshadowing, of course, because that principle can be applied to accessibility. Just because someone has an axe and a beard doesn't make them a Muslim lumberjack. They might just be an axe murderer who is sensitive about a slightly weak chin. This talk is about how both these people could very well use your web interface and how it's actually not your job to tell them apart. Let's start by talking about screen readers. Screen reader users are not necessarily blind users, and the term blind can also mean a host of different things anyway. It's just a shorthand. What alt text would you use to describe this image? I'm going to venture something like this. This is what I came up with. Colleagues gather in an office environment. 3 men look on attentively as their female leader points to something of interest on a computer monitor. A 4th man with a neo-Nazi haircut has become mesmerized by his own striped necktie. I think this probably needs some editing down for brevity. You could probably get rid of that last piece of information because it's not particularly salient. But more to the point, one time I made the mistake of using the following alt text instead. This is sometimes called null alt text or empty alt text. The idea is that if you place alt with an empty string on an image, that image will then be completely ignored by screen reader software. I'm sure there's many people in the audience who are already aware of that. My reasoning for the empty alt in this case was people who can't see this don't need to know about it because it's just generic corporate stock photography. It doesn't tell them anything useful about the product. But as I later realized, some screen reader users see something a bit like this, a blurred image. And others see something a bit like this, an image with blind spots. It turns out interest in generic corporate stock photography is more of a bell curve. People who can see it are immediately not interested in it. Nobody likes corporate stock photography. Nobody is inspired or edified by seeing it on a web page. You just say, there, it's garbage. People who cannot see it are probably not going to miss it because it is corporate stock photography. However, some partially sighted users will sort of see it, but don't know it's just generic stock. They will be looking for some sort of clarification. They want to know, they know the image is there, they want to know what's in it. Context is also a factor. On a website where you might buy or steal stock photography, interest is higher for everyone. Of course, over time, which is another variable, this interest diminishes. It's still corporate stock photography after all. What's the lesson here? A few of my talks actually have lessons, and the ones that you'll get here are going to be quite anemic. But the lesson here is partially sighted people exist. I would hope that people were aware of that already. Is the lesson not only blind but partially sighted people use screen readers? I mean, it kind of is, but that's not the real lesson. No, it's designed for the tools, not what you think you know about the users, because tools are shared, but people's lives are not. And I'll extrapolate on this throughout the talk. Quick sidebar. Some people do not like the term user because they think it makes their audience sound like drug addicts. My advice is this: care less about certain connotations of the term user and focus on not making toxic or addictive digital products. The term user is appropriate because it's only through the use of your interface that you should come to know the person using it. You don't need to know them outside of that, and seeking to know them that intimately is super creepy and probably illegal if you're not above the law like Facebook or Google seem to be. Thank you very much. One of the main reasons, besides privacy, that we shouldn't detect screen reader operation is that it enables us to put our limited experience and worst assumptions into action, tailoring those screen reader users, in this case, a unique and uniquely awful interface. And I better just describe the diagram here. It's a picture of a computer screen. On one side, there is an arrow, which is labeled normal interface and is pointing at the text normal user. And normal is spelt in the kind of uppy downy lowercase uppercase text, which is associated with the perennial SpongeBob SquarePants meme. And on the other side, it says optimized screen reader interface, TM as in trademark. There is a cluster of orbiting turds, and it points at the text screen reader user. Down the middle of this diagram is a dashed line with the text apartheid. Clearly, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. Designing for the web is and should be designing in and for the unknown. And that applies to accessibility as much as it does to responsive design. Let's look at another one. So blind users are not the same as other blind users. A few years ago, a blind screen reader user wrote something on a famous blog. Why I, a blind user, hate lists. When they shared their distaste for unordered lists, UL and LI or OL, those elements, essentially. They found them verbose and distracting and preferred when people didn't include them in the HTML because it complicated the screen reader output, I suppose. This precipitated a battle between well-meaning front-end developers, now armed with one data point, versus experienced accessibility professionals. Where's all the list markup gone? You're failing WCAG 1.3.1 all over the place. This is the WCAG rule that asks you to use semantic markup, essentially, so headings and list markup and the like. Blind people don't like it, so we got rid of it. Wait, which blind people? Didn't you read the article? The article? So you can see how that went. Taste is another thing we get distracted by. When a visitor to your website doesn't like it, we tend to feel hurt, but think, well, you can't please everyone. But when a disabled visitor finds it repellent, we tend to jump to the conclusion that it's inaccessible. If both visitors hate your website equally, it's not an accessibility issue. You've actually succeeded in creating an inclusively awful experience. Whenever I release a video about accessibility, someone has to kind of catch me out or point out the irony that I'm creating inaccessible content, or that the video itself has accessibility issues. The videos come with captions and transcripts, and they live on an accessibly marked up web page. So these detractors have to get quite creative to do this catching out business. And that's not to say that my content is perfect. There's no such thing as 100% accessible. Someone even said my videos aren't accessible because they include moving images, which is a difficult thing to avoid when making videos, or if you do avoid it, it kind of defeats the purpose of making a video. So I guess what I'm just saying is, please just be honest and say you don't like things, that it's a matter of taste rather than accessibility. Misleading or plain bad experiences are not necessarily inaccessible ones. This links label, and pictured is a href, which has the label, a nice video of a horse, is misleading because the link, the href, actually points to a video of Rick Astley singing his famous hit. But it's not inaccessible because it's not discriminating in how it misleads its audience. There is a parity of bad experience between, for example, screen reader users and non-screen reader users, or non-screen reader non-users. No, wait, screen reader non-users. That's what I think I meant to write there. Everyone is rickrolled equitably is the point. What's the lesson here? Accessibility is about achieving parity, not popularity. There's no accounting for taste, but unfortunately you don't have to account for it. Be especially careful during testing. I once met a partially sighted user with an interesting graphic design. They wanted us to describe what the logo for the company name looked like. Thick, bulbous, cursive, in white, leaning gently to the right, spelling out the word bulb. But the logo was used as the homepage link, meaning it should describe the link's destination. That's the commonly known use of alt text in that context. Bulb homepage was my recommendation, therefore, despite the feedback. So I had to not listen to this disabled user in this case. Short, direct, the information they actually need as a user and customer. That's what alt text for links should be. The case I had to make for this change was that disabled people aren't just disabled, and not all their interests are disability related. So who knew? So you tested with one disabled user. Great, you met a new person. You probably learned a lot of things about them and their disability, but you only met that person. Your job is not just to give them whatever they ask for. They don't speak for everyone, every disabled person or every person or any other demographic. The more testing you do and the more users you meet, the more you'll realize how unrepresentative your early encounters were of the non-existent, uniform disability demographic that existed exclusively in your head. Ultimately, you'll learn the only things any of your users really have in common are brains, sphincters, and access to an array of tools and technologies. And the brain and sphincter parts are already kind of a given. So, yeah. Another quick sidebar. That thing where you try to use a computer while wearing a blindfold, or lay on your own arm until it's numb, then try to operate a mouse. You're not going to learn anything about disability that way either. If you can't already comprehend that having impaired vision or motor control is going to make life more challenging, then 20 minutes of disability cosplay isn't going to precipitate any kind of epiphany. I actually wrote about this a while ago on Medium in an article called "What Breaking My Wanking Claw Taught Me About Accessibility," because I had broken my wrist kickboxing after drinking too much absinthe, which is a long story I won't go into. Anyway, thank you. Here's another one. Screen reader users are not necessarily power users. People make this mistake all the time. And I think it's partly because when you're working with disabled people, when you're working on accessibility, they tend to be really good at knowing what screen readers do and what they're doing in general. For the most part, front-end accessibility experts. At the BBC, we had ABCD tested 4 differently coded tab interfaces. The one with the correct ARIA attribution performed the worst. Why was that? Because participants were not familiar with ARIA tab interface semantics or behavior. They're a relatively new thing and quite a complex thing. One top participant thought they found some tags because they misheard the tab role as tag with a G. Multiple screen reader users did not know they had to use their arrow keys to switch tabs, and they got stuck and confused and dismayed. Welp. Some time ago, Paul Grenier from Dequis kind of gave me this testimonial for my book, Inclusive Components. No other reference example has been more perfectly plagiarized by as many UI developers as any single component from Inclusive Components. And I do set out at the beginning of the book that none of these components are perfect and that I'm not the leading light on this subject. It's just something that I like to explore, and I've done my best to represent those components correctly. I think it could be true that my ARIA tab interface implementation has been copied more than any other of its kind. Well, my advice today, and it has been for some time, is don't copy it if you can avoid it. And certainly don't put it in your design system, because then the whole organization will start using it if you actually manage to get your design system adopted, which is pretty hard work in itself. Not because it is a bad implementation, it's fine. I still stand by the code, but because it is a tab interface. Much as I'd love to say otherwise, live regions can also kind of suck. Briefly, a live region is an element that announces its contents when they change, like this. So pictured is an aside element with an ARIA live value of polite and an ARIA label value of status, and it's empty. And after that is a version of the same markup, but it includes the text node or the message. You have a new direct message, and that elicits the announcement of that text in screen readers when you inject that text using JavaScript. That is neat, and I think that's a really cool thing. I'm glad that that was specified and that it's been adopted by browsers. But before ARIA live regions became supported, the only way was to elicit something to be announced was to move focus to that text programmatically. So you'd maybe set tab index equals -1, not tab index 0, because then that would make a non-interactive element focusable. So you should avoid that. But moving focus is what made things be spontaneously announced without live regions. So anytime a live region is announced, users not familiar with them, and why would they be? They're not HTML and ARIA experts, would think their focus had just been stolen and moved. So they would imagine they're on a different part of their page and would feel disoriented. This can cause some confusion and anxiety. So there are, in fact, 2 ways that ARIA, accessible rich internet applications, can make a web page less accessible. 1, using ARIA incorrectly, and 2, using ARIA correctly. What is the lesson here? Train disabled users in ARIA. That would be quite intensive to go around and try and explain that specification to everyone. Developers, it's hard to get them to actually learn it properly. So asking Joe Public to learn it is probably a tall order. Is it stop using tab interfaces and live regions? Not entirely, but it's to be more judicious in what we use. The real thing I'm saying here, and the real kind of like message of this talk, the underlying message is do less. Just do less in general. Because most of what you do won't work as hard as you might try, or it won't work for everyone. To unpack that, what I'm saying is nothing is accessible to everyone. Therefore, anything you add to an interface can only make it less accessible overall. Simplicity or tersity, if you prefer, is the only panacea. For starters, you don't need to try and then fail to write the perfect alt text for this pointless corporate stock image if you don't include the image in the first place. Job done. Remember that not everything needs to be accessible. Some things shouldn't exist at all. And that especially applies to things which are unethical. When your job is to make an extremely unethical, addictive, destructive, awful interface and the company that backs it more accessible, you're just subjecting more people to it. This tab thing almost certainly should not exist anywhere when this plain content is evidently more robust, responsive, easier to operate, and less complex overall. And that's just, for those who can't see the image, that's just headings followed by text. And these damned question mark button things are everywhere. I can't stand these. Every accessibility audit I do, I have to tell people to stop hiding things inside these cryptic little question mark bubbles. Not hiding things from users is astonishingly, when you think about it, a better UX, not to mention an accessibility non-issue. Importantly, you don't need to know your own users to know these things. This stuff is kind of common sense. So you can stop creeping on them and collecting data on them and then getting bored and selling that data to someone nefarious. Another one, screen reader users are not necessarily disabled users. Screen reader users are screen reader users. They are people who have access to and are making use of that technology. That is all you really know. You may have heard this before. Accessibility isn't just for disabled people, it's for everyone. And whilst that's true, no, accessibility is for disabled people primarily as a priority. To say otherwise is a form of erasure. But that's not to say that the tools we commonly associate with disability, like screen readers, are not simply useful pieces of software. Screen readers are a source of text-to-speech, which has too many uses to mention. And screen readers are just one tool of many available to anyone who wants to use them. On the web, literally anyone could encounter your interface. So this whole idea of marketing doesn't even really work, like trying to work out who your market is. It could literally be everyone. So designing it for a subset of people is inherently problematic. Oh, we don't have any disabled users. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it? Yeah, and you never will with that attitude. But the thing about human diversity is it's really fucking diverse. So much so that your audience is fundamentally unknowable, meaning your research into that audience is really just an exercise in manufacturing preconception. It may say cold and impersonal, but interfaces are just inputs and outputs. And you would do well to see them that way, I think, in my opinion, or at least keep that in mind. Your job is to create simple, logical interfaces because they're the only ones that anyone can really operate. Supporting the available inputs and outputs, different assistive technologies, or just different technologies in general, which include assistive technologies and software, provided by the existing tools and technologies to achieve equivalent modality. An equivalent modality is just a pretentious way of saying the different kinds of input and output should make a comparable experience possible. Someone using this input and output should get as much value as someone using a different input and output. And I say possible because not everyone is actually looking for the same experience, of course. that is pretty much it. That's the way I see things at the moment when I approach inclusive design. The idea is to succeed at non-exclusion, where you might fail at inclusion. And that's it. I imagine that was quite a short run through, because I was rapidly losing my voice and going a little bit too fast. But that leaves plenty of time for questions I may or may not be able to answer. So I'll hand back to Lee.
No, excellent, Heydon. Thank you very much. That was a great talk. I keep meaning to catch some of your talks, and I somehow magically managed to always miss it.
I don't give
and I have to say, a lot of what you said very, very strongly resonated with a lot of my own experiences. Obviously, talking to certain clients, where particularly the case of, well, we spoke to that one user that happens to be using a screen reader, and that taking that one little data point as being representative of the group as a whole.
Yeah.
And I always take the example of, well, you wouldn't go to a sighted user and ask them which color do you like best between the two, and then based on their answer say all sighted users prefer this kind of shade of blue over this other one.
Exactly.
Yeah. So no, that certainly resonated very strongly with me. Now, Lee, you've been keeping an eagle eye on the YouTube and Mastodon. Have we got any questions coming in?
Yes, thank you, and thank you, Heydon. There are a couple questions in here, and I think there's a general joy to some of the, the stories that you shared, cracking me up. So appreciate that. But I think there's something really important here as a kind of a segue from all of the kind of practice that you're suggesting here. A question from Juliet saying, what is your approach to convince clients who are resisting simplifying their interface?
Oh, wow. That's a very good question. It's actually very difficult because I'm a designer, but I tend to be given development work because I can code. And we have this terrible thing where we have this binary where we're dividing things between development and design is using a graphical user interface for some reason, and development is writing code. So designers shouldn't code, and if you do learn to code as a designer, you're no longer allowed to call yourself a designer, and you have to become a developer. And a developer then is sort of relegated to being an implementer. And so unfortunately, a lot of the time, because I'm usually consulting people about their documentation or their design systems, it's past the point where the simplicity can be achieved, if you sort of mean. They've already accumulated lots of bad ideas and the technical debt that comes along with it, and they've implemented it in a sort of a kind of satanic patchwork quilt sort of way. But so I don't often get the opportunity, but I will say that when I am auditing an interface for accessibility, which is another thing that I do, quite often when I'm asked to assess a pattern or a component and give advice on how to make it accessible, I will frequently instead recommend a different, simpler interface. So I kind of leverage my my responsibility as an accessibility consultant or the accessibility person in the room to actually give them good reason to actually just change their design, simplify their design for everyone. So I usually kind of sneak it in there into audits in that way. I've done that with a recent client actually, where they were just trying to do things into, I wouldn't know how to make some of the stuff they were making accessible because it was absurdly kind of complex and contrived. So I just said, well, why don't you just do this? And then, yeah, so that's how I get it in there with clients. So it's often actually kind of accessibility clients rather than design clients, if you sort of mean. Although the design stage should be where you keep things Spartan, right?
I think there's something as well from earlier in the talk that kind of correlates to this as another avenue. And the way that I was thinking about, I think about the purpose of most of what we put out into the world is for people to engage with the content that is part of the website or whatever interface. And you were talking a little bit about hiding. And earlier talk, I was talking about carousels, for example. If your information is so important, why is it, 2 or 3 clicks away on a carousel? And
yeah,
in
and
your
there is an answer to that, and I think the answer is that developers who are not allowed to design and are not allowed to be in the room with designers, they like making things, playing with things, and achieving things. It's more complex and more impressive to have a little question mark which you click and then has an animated bubble appear from it than to just have some text. They don't feel like they've done anything. They don't feel like they've engaged with the development of the interface unless they do something complex. If they were allowed to be a part of the design process more, then they wouldn't be sort of desperately trying to squeeze in some of this creative energy, I think. So I do think that's part of it. It's the doing things to prove that to yourself that you can, and that kind of thing, or just trying to make things fancy, going for delight rather than utility. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that connects back to, there was a question earlier when you were talking about the tabs, and Owen had asked, what was the tab version that worked best with users? And
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. It was actually, if I recall correctly, it was a kind of hybrid one. So I can't exactly remember what all 4 were, but there was one that was like the ARIA tab interface as implemented with the semantics and the behaviors prescribed by the ARIA practices guide. That did poorly. Then there was one which looked like a tab interface, but was really just a set of same page links. So the tabs were same page links. And then it was using like something like the target pseudo class to switch between, or a little bit of JavaScript maybe on top to switch between the panels. But essentially to a screen reader, it was just links, which took you to different places. That didn't do great either. The one that worked pretty well was one which did have the ARIA tab semantics, but it didn't implement the arrow keys. And it didn't, it had kind of more of a prosaic interface, interaction paradigm for keyboard, basically. I believe that one just about did the best. But actually, in many circumstances, I've found that just having like a table of contents and then just content that is just available at all times, it's not going to impress many people. It's not going to seem like an exciting interface. And some people will tell you that they prefer a tab interface, but overall, it's something that people can cope with better. And yeah, so that would have been we were trying to do a tab interface at the time, so that was the brief, but I would go with that alternative, I think. Yeah.
do you have an opinion on tabs versus accordions?
Yeah, I do prefer accordions, and sometimes I will recommend accordions instead of tabs because you can appease people who still want to do fancy transition animations. But excuse me, my voice is really going. But the way you interact with it is much simpler because it is just tapping backwards and forwards, right? And it's also just more responsive. Like a tab interface is really difficult to make responsive, right? If you collapse the tabs into their own line so it looks kind of like an accordion, then I think a lot of people will then expect it to behave like an accordion as well. So they certainly wouldn't be expecting to press a right arrow key and for the focus to go downwards. So yeah, accordions are simpler, therefore they're better. But again, just text and headings is probably the best.
So here's something that we can kind of unpack as much or as simply as you'd like. Melissa asks, how do you approach simplifying something that is inherently complicated? Example, either something like a video game or a form with 30 questions, or I'll add as well the idea of a video that has a lot of visual representation and so on that maybe you want to provide in other formats, or where does simplicity come from in those circumstances?
Yeah, there's different approaches. I mean, not all, some things are just inherently complex. I mean, in those circumstances, what you really want to do is not add any extra complexity. So if you had like a really complex set of information, probably the worst thing to do would be to take every individual component piece of information and hide it behind a little circle with a question mark in it. So don't do that. With multi-part like questions, like quizzes, that kind of thing, that's not so hard to like what you're presenting the user at any one time should be simple, right? So just the one question and the one set of answers. Hide everything away and else away until it's pertinent, until they press next or what have you. So like forms, it's part of the gov.uk guidance in the UK is to break forms up into individual fields or inputs per page. So that seems to, I mean, I have trouble with processing lots of simultaneous information because I have very low executive functioning, like a poor RAM, basically. So parking meters immediately throw me because it's telling me everything at once, when I'd rather it gave me step one. Okay, I'll do that, and then it showed me step two. So I do think breaking things down like that is good. But I do think most of the time, I will say that most of the time, things which appear like they need to be complex don't need to be complex. It's like that old adage, if you can't explain something simply, then you don't understand it. And if you don't understand it, you shouldn't be making it, or you shouldn't be sharing it, at least. You shouldn't be communicating it to other people. You should go back and look at it again.
Yeah, I think forms are a great example of that. We have a lot of conversations in our work of, is this question necessary? And
Yeah.
I really appreciate your kind of distinction, and this is kind of getting into another level of engagement, but the designer is kind of in their own silo, the developers in their own silo. Once that things get to them, it's the decisions have kind of already been made. But sometimes, someone needs to be asking, like, why are we doing this again? What is the value behind this? Is it
Yeah.
understandable, conceivable?
Yeah, absolutely. And the classic one for me is always the gender field. We fuss a lot about what should be included in the gender field, like how many different kinds of gender representation should be there, when actually most of the time we shouldn't be asking people about their gender. It's not relevant,
Yeah.
right? Actually, there's one of my proudest moments was that I was consulting a very large organization about their inclusive design, and I was drawing up their inclusive design principles. And part of the work, I was also, whilst I was there, kind of like just making myself available to any folks in any of the departments who just wanted to ask about things. And someone asked about their gender field and how I thought it should be represented. And I said, actually, I think you should make the case to just get rid of it. And that became one of the guiding principles, was this principle of don't make an excuse for there to be some kind of level of heteronormativity there. So this was a music application. So the idea was they might advertise the idea that you would be interested in looking at a playlist as a married couple, and there was a representation of a male and female married couple and stuff like that. And it just not doing that is the answer, isn't it? So getting rid of that field, or getting rid of that interface, or getting rid of that content. Do less, like I said, especially when it comes to that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to even the original title. You don't know your users, you never will.
Mm-hmm.
And you kind of said it in the latter part of the talk. Your audience is unknowable, and I think that I buy into that, in the sense that we talk about this idea of, you'll do a little bit of user testing, and you're just kind of dabbling in the waters of the spectrum of diversity and the spectrum of intersectionality that's across everyone you're trying to serve. It's just this tiny, almost imperceptible dipping your toe in the ocean of understanding who your users are. Can you share again for everyone? I think this is really important of what your ethos is to deal with this, because it's not trying to get to know everybody.
Yeah, sure. So it's really just to approach it's embracing simplicity. That's my main kind of thing that I I kind of try and keep in mind if I'm designing or developing anything, is just what is the simplest way of doing this? Because the simpler like the more complex something becomes, the more room there is for error, right? The more faulty it's liable to be. And that's just a very basic principle. So make it as simple as you absolutely can is really the main thing. But it's this idea that I mean I'm using the screen reader or screen reader software really as more or less an analogy, although it does apply literally as well. But it's this idea that you have this tool and you start to associate it with certain types of people, but that doesn't you as soon as you start making those assumptions, you're in very, very dangerous territory. You're going to build something which is likely to alienate people because of those assumptions, but also you're likely to offend and marginalize people in a much more political way as well. And I think the difficult thing to get across, because I don't want to sound like somebody saying, well, don't bother doing research because what's the point? I do think research is important with users and especially with disabled users, but I think it doesn't serve the purpose you kind of think it's going to serve. I think the purpose of it is more to just from the outset and in the beginning of embarking on that kind of research, I think it's important for people to learn that all of their preconceptions about who those people who've turned up to that research are. As you only have to learn that once, right? You don't need to keep meeting people to know that you're going to be wrong every time. So from that point, once you've had that experience, I guess, and you've had that epiphany, from that point onwards, it's a case of just, yeah, just if it's like a fiddly, complex or innovative or unintuitive thing, it's just going to throw lots of people. And that's not to say that you should make boring products or boring interfaces, but you can make predictable and simple things which are just as exciting. And also, I think something that we tend to forget as people who make interfaces or who develop applications and do interaction design is that it really is the content that people are there for. People don't give a fuck about whether your buttons animate or whether you're using some sort of clever font or whatever. That's fun, and it's fun to show off your ability to do that. But like maybe apply that to doing art. Like, and you can do art with web technologies. That's something that I love doing. I'm doing a lot of stuff with a web audio API at the moment. And as I said, I do generative art as well, using like SVG and things like that. And I try to make those things accessible, but they're very, you can be very creative with those things. But if you're building like a public service or something, stop trying to fucking delight people, because they're going to be anything but delighted. They're going to be the opposite of delighted when they see that you've got this unusual, weird thing that you've put there just to try and stand out from the crowd. I may have just started rambling there. I don't know. I thought I'd answered that, but I'm not sure.
I think that's a great bookend, because that idea that the more complexity inherent, the more you're trying to understand how you're serving an individual, because you can't speak to everybody. The more complicated things are going to be for each individual, and you start to get this kind of runaway scale of trouble, because you're then trying to fiddle instead of just
Exactly.
getting
You
to
can't just keep learning and then unlearning and then relearning and then unlearning how a screen reader user thinks and behaves. It's like it doesn't doesn't matter how many times you do that, you're always going to be wrong because you're just going to remember the last thing that the last person said to you.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
yeah, it's just futile, hence the, or folly, hence the talk title. Yeah.
Like Alyssa says, Heydon is dead on. Intrinsic cognitive load is unavoidable, but you can rely on germane cognitive load, make it predictable, and avoid extraneous cognitive load. Don't try to be novel. Don't try to be
Wow,
fancy.
yeah, that's well put. I've never heard of cosmic cognitive load. I like that idea. Yeah, yeah, that puts it very well, I think. That's it in a
So I'm going
nutshell.
to pass it back to Patrick, and thank you again, Heydon. This was wonderful.
Thank you, Lee.
Yeah, and I was gonna just say, how much I felt it in my bones what you were saying about, designers just basically designing just for the sake of designing. And I just had a very boring minor anecdote of the other day. I just had to very quickly renew home insurance, and when you go to a website like that, and they were literally trying to have things flying in and delighting me when I didn't want to be delighted. I wanted home insurance.
Yeah,
and I see
but
that,
also I bet the core stuff
sorry.
didn't. Sorry, I was just going to say, but also I bet that because it never works for me. I bet none of the actual stuff that you expect
No.
work properly. No, exactly.
It all made it even more frustrating. And I see that Ian also put pretty much the same thought in our internal chat, saying the way that he explained it usually to designers is that nobody chooses who to buy car insurance from based on the styling of custom checkboxes.
Yeah.
It does certainly all resonate. So, but no, we're slowly running out of time. I just want to say thank you once again very much for the
Cheers, Patrick. It's been a pleasure.
talk. It was very entertaining, very insightful, and I love the swearing. So great stuff.
I was going to say the C word. No,
yeah, well, maybe not that far. You might get banned from platforms. But yeah, for the audience at home, if you like this session, you can smash that YouTube like button, and don't forget you can subscribe to our channel to be kept in the loop on our future events. Inclusive Design 24 is brought to you with thanks to our supporters: Barrier Break, Intopia, Infoaxia, Tetralogical, Intuit, Adrian Roselli LLC, Assistive Labs, the Law Office of Laney Feingold, Skyscanner, and Vispero. Inclusive Design 24 will be back on the hour with our next session, so hopefully see you then. Thank you very much.